The moment Sarah Miller saw him, the world stopped. She had been running for over 6 miles, the rhythmic pounding of her feet against the pavement blending with the sound of her heartbeat. The half marathon in Boston was supposed to be a distraction, just another way to keep moving, to convince herself that life went on. But then she saw him, Ethan Walker. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it hurt. He was there, running right beside her, his face turned toward her, smiling. Her breath caught, her body stumbled, nearly losing its rhythm. A cold wave crashed over her, followed by an unbearable heat in her chest. This wasn't possible. Ethan was dead. 1 year, 2 months, and 8 days ago, she had received the knock on her door. "We regret to inform you." The words had shattered her world. Ethan, the man she had loved with everything inside her, had gone missing during a dangerous mission. Presumed dead in combat. She had cried, screamed, begged for more answers that never came. And yet, here he was, running beside her, looking at her like she was the only thing that existed in the world. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. Her mind scrambled for an explanation. This was some kind of cruel illusion, a trick her exhausted brain was playing on her. But then he spoke. Sarah, that voice, that deep, familiar voice that had whispered love into her ear on sleepless nights, the voice she had memorized in her bones. She gasped, stumbling again, and this time, she stopped completely. The momentum of the other runners carried them past her, the world a blur of movement. But Sarah stood frozen in place. Ethan stopped too, turning fully toward her. He was real. His chest rose and fell, his breath visible in the cool autumn air. Sweat glistened on his forehead. His blue eyes, those same hauntingly beautiful blue eyes, locked onto hers, filled with something unspoken. Sarah's hands shook. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, but she was terrified. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be real. Tears burned at the edges of her vision. Her lips trembled. "Ethan," she whispered. He nodded. "It's me, Sarah." A sob tore through her chest. Her mind screamed at her to run away, because if this was a dream, she never wanted to wake up. But if it wasn't, if this was real, then nothing would ever be the same again. 2 years earlier, the sun dipped low over the Boston skyline, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. The air smelled of rain, fresh, clean, the kind of scent that made you want to close your eyes and breathe deep. Sarah Miller sat on the hood of Ethan's old Ford truck, her arms wrapped around herself, even though she wasn't cold. Ethan Walker leaned beside her, one foot on the bumper, his body relaxed, but she knew him too well. He wasn't relaxed at all. His fingers drummed against his thigh, his jaw tight. He was thinking about how to tell her. She already knew. Sarah swallowed hard, staring at the parking lot of the diner where they had shared so many late-night meals, stolen kisses, whispered dreams. This was their spot, the place where life had always felt simpler. But tonight, the weight in the air was crushing. "Just say it," she whispered, unable to look at him. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried unspoken words. "They're deploying us." She closed her eyes. There it was. Her fingers clenched against the metal of the truck. She had spent months pretending this wouldn't happen, that somehow the world would give them more time. "How long?" she asked, voice tight. "Could be a year, maybe more." The words sliced through her like a knife. She turned her head, finally meeting his gaze. His blue eyes were steady, but filled with something she rarely saw in them. Fear, not for himself, for her. Sarah forced a small, bitter smile. "You always told me you wanted to see the world." "Yeah," he murmured, shifting closer. "But I never wanted to see it without you." A lump rose in her throat. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together, and suddenly her eyes burned. She couldn't lose him. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, barely above a whisper. "You don't have to," he said gently. "Just wait for me." Sarah let out a choked laugh. "That's not fair." "I know." His thumb brushed over her knuckles, slow, steady. "But I need you to, Sarah, because I swear to you I'll come back." She blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in her eyes. You can't promise that. Yes, I can. He squeezed her hand tighter. I will come back to you. A tear slipped down her cheek. He reached out, catching it with his thumb, and the tenderness in his touch shattered her completely. You have to promise me something too, he said softly. She swallowed hard. What? No matter how hard it gets, no matter how much it hurts, you keep living. Sarah stiffened. Ethan, I mean it. His voice was firm now, the kind of tone he used when he wouldn't take no for an answer. You run your races. You laugh. You don't put your life on hold for me. A sharp pain pressed into her ribs, because deep down, she knew what he was doing. He was trying to prepare her for the worst. She shook her head. I don't want a life that doesn't have you in it. You'll always have me. He touched her chest, right over her heart. Right here. Sarah closed her eyes, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill over. Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead, slow, lingering, full of unsaid words. She gripped his shirt, her fingers desperate to hold on to something solid. I love you, he murmured. Her voice broke. I love you too. For the longest time, they stayed like that, wrapped in each other, ignoring the truth that loomed over them. Because by this time tomorrow, he'd be gone. 1 year later, the knock on the door came at exactly 4:12 p.m. Sarah froze. Her heart knew before her mind did. A cold, sick feeling spread through her stomach as she walked to the door on unsteady legs. She opened it. 2 uniformed officers stood there, stiff, expressionless. Her world tilted. Miss Miller. No, not this. Not this. She couldn't breathe. She barely heard the words that followed. We regret to inform you. Sergeant Ethan Walker has been reported missing in action. Presumed deceased. Sarah's vision blurred. A sharp, deafening ring filled her ears. Somewhere in the distance, a voice, her own, let out a strangled, broken sound. Her knees gave out, and just like that, the world went dark. Sarah's entire body trembled. The marathon, the runners, the cheering crowds, all of it blurred into nothing. Only one thing existed in that moment. Ethan, standing in front of her, alive. A violent shiver ran through her. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Her mind had finally snapped, creating some cruel, desperate illusion of the man she had lost. But then Ethan took a step closer. His breath was heavy, his chest rising and falling, his skin glistening with sweat just like hers. He wasn't a ghost. He was flesh and blood. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Sarah. His voice was hoarse, almost like he was afraid she'd vanish if he spoke too loudly. She flinched. It was the same voice. The same voice. Ethan swallowed hard, his blue eyes locked onto hers, searching, waiting. It was too much. Too much. Sarah took a shaky step back. Ethan's expression flickered with pain, but he didn't move. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. Her heart was breaking all over again. Her voice failed. Her mind screamed 1,000 questions, but none of them made it past her lips. Ethan took another step toward her, slow, cautious. It's me, Sarah. Tears burned her eyes. No, she choked out. No, this isn't possible. His brows furrowed. Sarah, I buried you. The words ripped out of her, raw and trembling. A couple of runners glanced their way, but she didn't care. She couldn't care. Ethan flinched. No, you didn't. She shook her head violently. I got the visit, the officers. They told me you were gone, Ethan. You were dead. Her chest ached, her lungs screaming for air. I mourned you. I tried to keep living like you told me to, but She broke off, a sob threatening to escape. Ethan's face twisted with something unreadable. Grief, regret, something deeper. Sarah, he murmured, stepping even closer. She backed up again, shaking her head. No, you were gone. A heavy silence stretched between them. Ethan clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening with emotion. And then, finally, he spoke the words that shattered everything. I never died, Sarah. She stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. Ethan inhaled sharply, as if the truth physically hurt to say, I was captured. Sarah's stomach dropped. I spent a year in enemy territory, he continued, his voice rough. I was taken prisoner. They held me. He stopped, looking away for a second, his throat working. He swallowed hard and turned back to her. The military thought I was dead. They told you I was dead. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. No, no. Her vision blurred. A wave of nausea crashed over her. Ethan had been alive that whole time, suffering, alone, and she had never known. Her lips trembled. How did you? His jaw tightened. I escaped. Her breath hitched. 3 months ago, he said, his voice steady, but his eyes carried the weight of hell. I found a way out. It took time, but I made it back. Sarah covered her mouth with a trembling hand. 3 months. For 3 months, he had been free, alive. A fresh wave of pain slammed into her, and he hadn't come back to her. Her hands dropped to her sides, fingers curling into fists. You were free. You were alive. Her voice cracked, her chest heaving. Why didn't you come back? Ethan's face filled with something she couldn't name. Guilt. Fear. I wanted to, he admitted. God, Sarah, I wanted to, every damn day. But he stopped, dragging a hand over his face. I wasn't the same person anymore. Sarah let out a choked, bitter laugh. You think I care about that? Ethan exhaled harshly. I care about that. The pain in his voice cut through her like a blade. Sarah's entire body trembled. Her heart screamed to go to him, to hold him, to erase all the time they had lost. But something inside her hesitated. Because this wasn't the same Ethan who had promised to come back. His face had hardened. His body, once so familiar to her, seemed different. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held something dark now, something that hadn't been there before. This was Ethan, but it wasn't. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I thought I lost you forever. His face twisted with emotion. You almost did. Sarah's breath hitched. Ethan took a careful step closer, his voice dropping. But I held on, Sarah. I held on because of you. A sob broke from her lips. Ethan reached for her, slowly, cautiously, and this time, she didn't back away. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative, testing. Sarah gasped at the contact. He was warm, solid, real. Her head swam. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. Ethan was alive, and he had come back for her. Sarah's fingers trembled in Ethan's grasp. The warmth of his skin burned into hers like a brand, but her mind still couldn't fully process what was happening. He was alive. She had spent over a year grieving him, trying to accept that she would never see him again. And now, in the middle of a marathon, with the sound of pounding footsteps and distant cheers all around them, he was here. Her body screamed to throw herself into his arms, to hold him so tightly he could never disappear again. But something stronger, something colder, kept her frozen in place. Because this wasn't a fairy tale reunion. Ethan had been alive for months, and he hadn't come back to her. Sarah yanked her hand away as a sharp pain bloomed in her chest. You let me think you were dead. Ethan's expression flickered, like he had been expecting those words. He nodded slowly. I did. Her breath hitched. The sheer weight of it all crashed into her at once. The agony of losing him, the nights spent drowning in grief, the endless emptiness of a life without him, and now, this. Ethan was standing in front of her, whole but not the same. You were free for 3 months, she whispered, her voice breaking. And you didn't tell me. Ethan exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his face. I know. Sarah's heart clenched. Why? He hesitated, looking away for a moment, his jaw tightening. I didn't know how, he admitted. I didn't know if I could. Her throat closed up. Ethan Walker, the man who had never hesitated a day in his life, was now standing in front of her, unsure, unsteady. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The person you lost, Sarah, The one who promised he'd come back. I don't know if I'm him anymore. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. I spent almost a year in a cell, Ethan continued, his voice rough. A dark, filthy hole in the ground. They barely fed us. They kept us in the same clothes for months. They used us, played games with us, broke us piece by piece. His eyes darkened. Most of the men I was with didn't make it out. Sarah's breath stilled. She could see it now, the haunting weight in his eyes, the stiffness in his posture, the exhaustion carved deep into his face. This wasn't just the Ethan she had loved. This was a man who had crawled out of hell. I fought to stay alive, he said quietly. Every single day, I fought, because I told myself that if I could just make it back, if I could just see you again. His voice cracked, just barely. Sarah sucked in a shaky breath. But then I got out, he continued, his jaw working. And I wasn't the same. I wasn't whole anymore. And I thought, he swallowed. I thought maybe you'd be better off if I just stayed gone. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the gut. You thought I'd be better off thinking you were dead. Ethan's face twisted with guilt. I was trying to protect you. Protect me. Her voice rose, raw and shaking. You weren't protecting me, Ethan. You destroyed me. Ethan flinched. Sarah wiped at her face furiously, trying to breathe, trying to stay standing beneath the weight of all of it. You said you fought to come back to me. Her voice broke. But you didn't. You got out. You were free. And you still left me behind. A deep, heavy silence fell between them. Ethan's eyes were full of something unreadable. Pain, shame, love, all of it at once. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to scream, to cry, to punch him for putting her through this nightmare. But most of all, she wanted to hold him and never let go. Because despite everything, despite the agony and the anger, one brutal, inescapable truth remained. She still loved him. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't even care that strangers were staring, that the marathon was still going, that the world was spinning on as if nothing had changed. Because for her, everything had changed. Ethan took a step closer, his hands twitching at his sides, like he wanted to reach for her but didn't know if he should. I didn't come back because I was afraid, he admitted, voice tight. Afraid of what I'd become. Afraid that if you saw me now, you wouldn't. His voice broke. He clenched his jaw, shaking his head. Sarah's chest ached. She stepped forward. Just one step, closing a fraction of the space between them. You don't get to decide what I can or can't handle, she whispered. Ethan's breath caught. I don't care how much you've changed, she continued, her voice trembling. I don't care how broken you think you are. You're here, and that's all I ever wanted. A sharp inhale. Ethan's hands twitched again. His entire body tensed like he was holding back. Sarah hesitated for only a second. Then she reached out and grabbed his hand. Ethan exhaled shakily, his grip tightening around hers like she was the only thing keeping him standing. His thumb brushed against her knuckles, slow and reverent, like he was memorizing the feeling, like he didn't quite believe this was real. Sarah took a deep breath, the world tilting back into focus. The past was still there. The pain, the time lost, it still mattered. But so did this moment. He was here, and she wasn't ready to let him go. Sarah's fingers tightened around Ethan's hand, her grip desperate, like if she let go, he might disappear again. Her heart was racing, her body trembling from something far more powerful than exhaustion. She had spent over a year grieving him, mourning him, trying to rebuild a life without him. And now, here he was. But he wasn't the same. Neither of them were. The sounds of the marathon faded into the background, the pounding of feet against the pavement, the distant cheers, the announcer's voice over the speakers. None of it mattered. The world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Ethan was staring at their joined hands, his thumb tracing slow, hesitant circles against her skin. His body was tense, his jaw clenched. He looked like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched. Sarah swallowed hard. Ethan, His grip tightened for just a second before he exhaled and let go. The loss of warmth was immediate. He took a step back, raking a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, a storm of emotions he wasn't ready to name. Sarah's chest ached. Ethan had always been the strongest person she knew, unshakable, fearless. But the man standing in front of her now? This was a man who had been to hell and barely crawled out. She took a slow breath. "What happened to you?" Ethan's jaw flexed. His gaze flickered to the ground, to the sky, anywhere but her. "I survived." His voice was low, rough. Sarah's throat tightened. "Tell me." He hesitated, his hands curled into fists at his sides, and then, finally, he did. "I was on patrol with my team," he said quietly. "We were moving through a village, clearing buildings. We had done it 100 times before. Nothing felt different." His voice darkened. Then the first shot rang out. Sarah's stomach twisted. Ethan exhaled sharply, his gaze distant, as if he were right back there, trapped in the memory. "We were ambushed," he continued. "2 men went down in the first 60 seconds. We never saw it coming." His voice tightened. "I tried to get to them, but there were too many. We fought. We held them off as long as we could." He swallowed hard. "But in the end, I was the only one left." Sarah's breath caught. "I was injured, took a hit to the leg, nothing fatal, but it slowed me down." His hands clenched. "They dragged me out of there, took my gear, my dog tags, left nothing behind except blood." Sarah closed her eyes, a fresh wave of pain and nausea washing over her. That's why they thought he was dead. There had been nothing left of him. Ethan inhaled sharply. "They kept me in a cell, isolated. No light, no sound. Days passed. Weeks. I lost track of time." His voice lowered. "They wanted information. I didn't give them anything, so they made sure I paid for it." Sarah's entire body went cold. Ethan glanced at her, reading the horror on her face, and quickly shook his head. "I'm here, Sarah. I made it out." She forced herself to breathe. "How?" Ethan hesitated. "A man on the inside. He wasn't one of them, just someone who had been trapped there too. He got me out." His jaw tightened. "He didn't make it." Sarah's heart shattered. She couldn't imagine what he had been through. The pain, the loneliness, the constant battle to stay alive. Ethan met her gaze then, his eyes dark and serious. "Do you know what kept me breathing, Sarah?" She swallowed, unable to speak. His voice was barely a whisper. "You." Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Ethan took a slow step closer. "Every time I wanted to give up, every time I thought I couldn't take another day, I thought about you." He exhaled shakily. "I thought about your laugh, the way you wrinkle your nose when you're trying not to cry, the way your hands feel when you hold mine." Sarah sucked in a sharp breath. "I made a promise to you," he murmured. "I told you I'd come back." He shook his head. "And even when the whole world thought I was dead, I never stopped trying." Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks. Ethan reached up, slowly, cautiously, and wiped one away with his thumb. The warmth of his touch burned into her skin. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan's hand dropped back to his side. His expression darkened again, conflicted. "But now that I'm here," he hesitated. "I don't know if I deserve to ask you to love me again." Sarah's breath caught. "I don't know if I'm the man you fell in love with," he admitted, voice low. "I don't know if I ever will be again." Silence. Sarah's heart was aching, a whirlwind of emotions battling inside her, because deep down, she knew the truth. No, he wasn't the same man who left her, but neither was she. The pain, the grief, the years stolen from them, none of it could be undone. But right now, in this moment, she had a choice. She could keep running, keep pretending that love alone wasn't enough to fix what had been broken, or she could stop and let him in. Sarah swallowed past the lump in her throat. Then, without thinking, she reached down, grabbing his hand again. Ethan stiffened, his eyes searching hers, filled with hesitation, with hope. Sarah took a slow breath. "I don't care if you've changed. Ethan's grip tightened around hers. She met his gaze, steady and sure. "I never stopped loving you." A sharp exhale. Ethan looked at her like she was the only thing keeping him standing. Sarah's chest ached. She stepped closer. Just one step. And Ethan, he didn't move away. Because for the first time in over a year, he wasn't running. And neither was she. Sarah's pulse pounded as she stared into Ethan's eyes. The weight of everything they had lost, the time, the pain, the love left unfinished, hung between them like a fragile thread, waiting to snap. The marathon continued around them, runners passing by, feet pounding against the pavement, cheers rising in the distance. But Sarah wasn't running anymore, and neither was Ethan. His fingers curled tighter around hers, like he was afraid she might change her mind, that she might let go and disappear. His grip was strong, desperate, real. Sarah inhaled sharply. She could still walk away. She could still turn around, disappear into the crowd, bury this moment deep inside her and pretend it never happened. But hadn't she already lost him once? She didn't want to lose him again. Sarah exhaled, her chest tight, and took a step forward. Ethan's breath caught, his entire body tensing, waiting. And then, she ran, but not away, toward him. Ethan barely had time to react before Sarah collided into his chest, her arms wrapping around him with a force that nearly knocked them both over. A broken sound escaped his throat, a half sob, half laugh, and in the next second, his arms were around her, holding on like he'd never let go. Sarah buried her face into his shoulder, her tears soaking into the fabric of his shirt. He smelled different. Not like the Ethan she remembered, but like the Ethan who had survived. And that was enough. Ethan's breath hitched, his body shaking against hers. His grip was almost painful, but Sarah didn't care. She pressed herself closer, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart against her own. Alive. He was alive. "I thought I lost you forever," she choked out. Ethan exhaled shakily, pressing his forehead against the side of her head. "I'm here." His voice broke. "I'm here, Sarah." A sharp pang shot through her chest. For months, she had dreamed of this moment, waking up to find it had all been a mistake, that he had somehow made it back to her. But she had never imagined the broken man now holding her like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath hitching. They had lost so much, but they still had now, and maybe that was enough. A sudden roar of applause filled the air. Sarah blinked, pulling back slightly, just enough to look around. The marathon crowd had noticed them. Dozens of spectators and runners had stopped, watching the reunion unfold in the middle of the course. Sarah's face burned, but Ethan only let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. Then, he looked at her. Really looked at her. His fingers brushed against her cheek, gentle, reverent, as if memorizing every detail of her face. His blue eyes, those same beautiful, haunted blue eyes, searched hers for something unspoken. Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached up, gripping the front of his shirt, and kissed him. Ethan inhaled sharply, his body stiffening for a split second. Then he melted into her, his arms crushing her against him as his lips moved against hers. The world around them disappeared. There was no war, no pain, no time lost, just this, just them. The moment stretched on, their breaths tangled, their hands desperate, like they were trying to piece each other back together. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah didn't let go. Neither did Ethan. His forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. A sharp breath. Ethan closed his eyes, his fingers tightening on her waist. "I never stopped fighting for you," he murmured. Sarah's throat burned. They had a long road ahead. There were still wounds to heal, ghosts to face. Ethan wasn't the same. Neither was she. But none of it mattered, because he was home. And as she held him in the middle of the marathon course, the cheers and applause rising around them, Sarah knew she wasn't running anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be, with him, Some stories are about love, others about pain. This one was about both. Sarah and Ethan lost everything: time, hope, the future they had planned together. But in the end, they found what truly mattered, the love that never left them, even in the darkest moments. Life doesn't always give us easy answers. Sometimes, it forces us through storms that seem impossible to survive. But when there is something worth fighting for, someone who keeps us alive, even on the hardest days, there is always a way back. Ethan never stopped fighting. Sarah never stopped waiting. And in the end, fate brought them back to each other. If this story touched your heart, remember, true love isn't perfect, but it is strong enough to survive even the hardest battles. Thank you so much for following this journey. I hope it moved you as much as it moved me to write it. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to feel the power of this reunion. See you next time.